Oh, Mr. Now, I promised a lot of my viewers that you would talk about the Korean War. I know it's been a few months, I've just been busy, but I managed to get Goober here. Could you just enlighten us a little bit about the Korean War?
Sure. Well, Specialist Goober, I hope you take some notes here and bring it back to the E4 Mafia. The Korean conflict. Some people have called this the Korean Civil War, which to me, that's an inaccuracy. It really is a two nations at war with each other. Brief overview of the Korean nation. Um, Prior to the Second World War, Korea had been a Japanese commonwealth, well, actually a colony. Korea was seized by the Japanese Empire in 1910, 5 years after the Japanese defeat of Tsar Russia during the 1904-1905 Russo-Japanese War. It was a Japanese occupied land for 35 years, and when the Japanese Empire surrendered, they basically gave up the protectorate of Korea. So you had the Soviet Union had taken the northern part of the Korean peninsula, established a Korean regime, a Korean communist regime under Kim Il-sung, whereas the southern part of Korea was influenced by the United States, and then they had back their leader there, Syngman Rhee. The Korean peninsula was divided on pretty much in the center of the nation, known as the 38th parallel. Well, in June 1950, Kim Il-sung decided, well, I want to unify the Korean peninsula under communist rule. So with Soviet backing, he had hundreds of T-34-85 tanks, basically a rehash of World War II equipment. Sturmovik dive bombers, Yak and MiG propeller-driven fighter planes. They were using Soviet rifles, submachine guns, mortars, artillery. South Korean forces were different. They did not really have a stand-up force. It was almost more like a constabulary force. They basically had infantry hand weapons. And so when they made a offensive drive in June, basically a lot of powers in Washington and the world remembered what happened prior to World War II when nobody stopped Nazi Germany's and Imperial Japan's aggression. It pretty much led to World War II. And so basically, like a lot of people said, we don't want a repeat of that. They took their case to the United Nations, and had to be a unanimous vote amongst the powers to have UN intervention in the Korean Peninsula. Now, the funny thing about that vote was the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republic, the Soviet Union, realized, you know what, we're not going to take part in this vote. Because of the Union not taking part in that vote, the United Nations voted unanimously to intervene in Korean conflict. Just that one vote, if the USSR did not boycott that vote and decided not to intervene, there would have been no US intervention in the Korean conflict. So basically, the United States had to kind of hurry up and build an ad hoc force to meet the North Korean threat. Right now, about 3 days after the offensive, Seoul was pretty much overrun by North Korean forces. So a small understrength battalion known as Task Force Smith, led by Lieutenant Colonel Charles Smith, who was a West Point graduate and a veteran of the Pacific War, pretty much was given orders to slow down the Korean drive and then bring in more add-on forces into what's known as the Pusan perimeter. And then from there, Task Force Smith was pretty much overran in a short amount of time, but allowed more follow-up forces from Japan to come in and reinforce the area near the Pusan perimeter, to reinforce it, to bring in more and more troops. And then around the fall, September 1950, Joe MacArthur made his end-run flanking attack on the North Korean shore of Incheon, North Korean town of Incheon, in order to change the tide of the war.
Very good. Mr. Nell, Goober and I have been to the Middlesex Museum, which is the Chesty Puller Museum. Can you fill in my viewers about Chesty Puller?
Sure. Lieutenant General Louis B., known as Chesty Puller, United States Marine Corps, probably one of the greatest Marines to ever live. People will question me on that, but I'm biased. Yes, to me, he is one of the greatest Marines to ever live. He was commissioned a second lieutenant in the Marine Corps just prior to the American intervention in Haiti, just before the American intervention in World War I. Chester received his first baptism of fire in Haiti around 1915 or so, just before American jumped into World War I. Chesty would go on to fight in other wars as well, like in Central America, what people known as the Banana Wars in Nicaragua. It was in Nicaragua that Chesty, well, let me backtrack a little bit. I believe it was Haiti that Chesty had been the recipient of his first Navy Cross. He would go on to receive other Navy Crosses in Nicaragua and in World War II, in the battles of Guadalcanal all the way up to the other battles of the Central Pacific. Chesty would go on to be a recipient of his third and fourth, and his fifth Navy Cross came during the Battle of Incheon, where UN Allied forces were closing in on basically on the Chinese border of North Korea. Headquarters and other intelligence agencies kept warning General MacArthur, do not approach the Chinese border, because they saw a buildup of Red Chinese forces. And then when MacArthur didn't heed that warning, the Chinese intervened in November 1950. During that battle, during the invasion, it was in the battle known as the Chozon Reservoir, where Chesty shined and received his fifth Navy Cross. He was leading, there was the one Marine division during the battle of Chozon Reservoir was surrounded by upwards up to maybe up to 8 Chinese divisions. And basically, when asked if the Marines were retreating by a reporter, the Marines said, no, we're just fighting in a different direction.
Wow. Well, thank you very much on that. Mr. Nell, what are you going to talk to me now about the Korean War?
Well, during the battle of the Chozon Reservoir, Marine units, the only way they can get resupplied is from the air. And so the Marine called out for resupply of ammunition. They were short of ammunition. And so they had the code for an ammunition drop known as Tootsie Roll. Well, whoever was getting the receiving end did not get the correct codes of that day, because codes changed on a daily basis. So you send a code, and then it's your job to decode that, and then they'll sending what is a Tootsie Roll. And then the person who the receiving end of that message did not get the day's new codes. So they literally dropped Tootsie Roll candy, which the Tootsie Roll was for ammunition, especially 50 caliber ammunition for the Browning 50 caliber machine guns, as well as light mortars for 60 millimeter and medium mortars for 81 millimeter. Well, the Tootsie Roll mistake ended up to be a blessing, because when the Tootsie Rolls were dropped, they actually provided a source of quick energy for the troops. They would put it in their mouths and it's so cold you just can't really chew it. And so they would also take the Tootsie Rolls, put it inside close to their bodies, and they would soften up. So they used the gooey candy Tootsie Roll to patch up holes in damaged equipment, or like in damaged trucks, Jeeps. They used it also to plug up holes. From that moment on, the United States military, of all branches, decided we need to pay more attention to that encoding and decoding practice. But still, that mistake ended up being a blessing.
Wow, and that's an amazing story, and there's the Tootsie Roll.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Nell. I don't have a follow-up on that one. That was so unique. I don't have a question to ask you. So, Mr. Nell, what are you going to tell me now about the Korean War?
Well, During during General MacArthur's landing at the North Korean port of Incheon, first there was a wave of Marines that were landing into got into a Higgins boat or a landing craft, utility boat, and then they approached the seawall on Walmy-Do Island. Well, this landing craft here, not like in the Pacific landings where they can drop the forward ramp, because of the high seawalls, they had to use these just basically ladders to scale over. Now, when I was a boy, this picture had always intrigued me. In many conflicts, there's always an iconic photograph, like the Marines raising of the Stars and Stripes over Mount Suribachi. Well, to me, this is the Korean War's version of that. It's not that well famous, but this Marine is an officer. How do I know he's an officer? He has an M1 carbine. Still, how do I know he's an officer? He's leading from the front. Well, this Marine officer happens to be First Lieutenant Baldemaro Lopez, the son of Spanish immigrants. He enlisted in the Navy in 1943. In 1944, he was accepted to the U.S. Naval Academy. He went through a 3-year program rather than a 4-year program. But by the time he graduated from the United States Naval Academy, the Second World War was already 2 years over. But during the landing at Incheon, he was a platoon leader of these Marines right here on this Higgins boat that was climbing over the seawall on Walmy-Do Island. Shortly after the photograph was taken, Lieutenant Lopez and his men were charging this North Korean gun emplacement. He saw the gun emplacement, pulled out a grenade, and he was about to pitch it at them. Well, he got struck by rifle fire, and the grenade had fallen out of his hand. And then at that moment on, he noticed that his platoon was directly right behind him. He knew if that grenade go off, it would have hurt and maybe killed some of his Marines. So he sacrificed himself by smothering the grenade that he was about to throw at the enemy, and he smothered himself. He smothered the grenade with his own body, the explosion thus killing him. Lieutenant Lopez was thus posthumously awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for his heroic actions.
Wow. Very nice. That is a heart-wrenching story. Thank you. Well, Mr. Nell, was there any major weapons changes from the World War II to the Korean War?
The only weapons changes were maybe from the aviation side, where jets were first introduced by the Germans in combat at the tail end of World War II. But the infantry side, nothing really changed at all, maybe for a few exceptions. Number one, the World War I, people much know the M1 carbine. Well, during World War II, a lot of troops who were issued the carbine complained about, well, there was no bayonet lugs on the carbine. A lot of troops just jury-rigged something to that way they can put a bayonet on the carbine, because it wasn't really meant to be used as an infantry weapon. But infantrymen, especially in the Pacific side, it's lightweight, 15-round capacity, and had a decent killing power up to 300 yards. So by the time the Korean War came about, bayonet lugs were starting to be seen on the M1 carbine. They were basically came about during the tail end of World War II, but didn't see any service at all. Another thing was there was some select fire versions of the M1 carbine, meaning that it could fire both semi or full automatic. Some say the introduction of the Sturmgewehr 44 influenced somebody to say, let's see if we can make the M1 carbine a select fire weapon. And they did. They made it. They did make a select fire version to fire full automatic. Again, at the tail end of World War II, it never really saw any service. And another thing was the introduction of 30-round magazines. Originally, it was equipped with the M1 carbine was equipped with 15-round box magazines. And then the 30-rounders came about because of the introduction of the Select Fire M2. They had to kind of strengthen the magazine well of the carbine, because the 30-round mag is kind of a little bit heavier than the 15-round mag, so they needed to kind of strengthen the magazine well. And basically, in terms of infantry weapons, the only other one I can see that was different was the introduction of larger caliber, shoulder-fired rocket launchers, people known as bazookas. During the Second World War, our people known as bazookas, they were like within 50 to 60 millimeter in caliber. They could knock out, well, they weren't, even though they didn't knock out the German panzers, you can disable them with a mobility kill, hitting the treads or hitting the very soft sides. But when they're up against the T-34-85s, it just didn't have enough explosive power even to penetrate the side thinner armor. The most they can get from the 60 millimeter rocket launchers were a mobility kill on the treads. Again, on the tail end of World War II, these 90 millimeter bazookas or rocket launchers were finally introduced. The United States forces had captured some German copies of the bazookas known as Panzerschreck. They were 88 millimeter in caliber. They said, well, basically the Panzerschreck was a copy of captured American bazookas. So turnabout was just, we were turnabouts as, okay, let's do what the Germans did with their Panzerschreck and up the caliber up to 90 millimeter. And then when the 90 millimeter bazookas were introduced during the battle or the Pusan perimeter, they had enough explosive power to knock out, do some kill shots on the T-34's thinner side armor.
Wow. Is it a two-man crew for a bazooka team?
Yes, it's known as a crew-served weapon. You have a gunner and you have a loader.
And how many rounds would they carry? Were they heavy?
It depends on the situation. The loader can carry anywhere between 4 to maybe half a dozen. I mean, they're kind of weighty.
All right. Well, I learned so much, and so doesn't Goober here. Thank you, Mr. Nell, for your time and helping my channel grow. Stay safe, be kind, and be courteous, everyone, and visit the Maryland Veterans Museum in Newburgh, Maryland.